I wrote a book which came out a few months ago called The Power and the Story, which is about journalism in the world, including in Russia and other parts of the world, China, Europe, United States. And it was an attempt to describe what our profession here, your profession, is now like throughout the world. It's quite different in different places, but one of the divisions I made was between authoritarian journalism written in authoritarian states, and democratic journalism in democratic states. There's no sharp division between them. It's more a series of a spectrum of differences. But it's worth making that division, I think, because authoritarian states and democratic states have different ways of operating in the area of mass media. I'd like, in the discussion, for you to tell me, tell us your impression of how to work in an authoritarian state. Journalism began in probably the early 17th century, 1600s. And it began for a variety of reasons. One, there were people who, a wider circle of people could read. Reading had been, in centuries before, really restricted to very, very few people, very often monks, religious leaders. But by the 16th century, 17th century, quite a lot of people could read, including people who were not rich, not powerful. And newspapers, news sheets then began to serve these people. And they were about a number of things. Leonid Nikitinski talked about it earlier. They were about political and religious, perhaps especially religious struggles. They were about business information, the need for information, especially on trade. They were answering the demand for entertainment. Entertainment which included gossip, usually about the aristocracy, about powerful people. And all of these things are still in journalism today, everywhere. Political struggle, not so much religious now, at least not in the West. Information, business information, very important. Entertainment, even more important. Gossip, of course. What's been added are a number of things. Investigative journalism really didn't exist early on. It does now. It's a very important part of journalism where you dig deeper into events and personalities to find out the truth of events and personalities. And there's a lot more entertainment news, celebrity news, because there are lots of celebrities and there's a lot of entertainment. And of course it's much faster, especially in the age of the internet. But the largest shift that happened in journalism was really in the 19th century. And that was when, the idea that journalism should have a public purpose. That is, the public purpose was even a moral purpose. And that purpose was to inform citizens so that they could be fully citizens, that they could understand what was happening in society, their own society, other countries, learn the truth about their governments, learn what the governments were saying, what opposition people were saying. That idea began really in Western Europe, France, United Kingdom, United States in the mid-19th century, and grew, and after the last war, after the Second World War, became embedded in the idea of journalism, that journalists entered journalism with a sense not just to make money, sometimes money, there wasn't much money anyway, but with a sense of public purpose, public mission. They were doing something for society as well as for themselves. And that grew as the growth of the professional classes, middle classes grew further as working class representation in trade unions and then in parliaments grew, and newspapers grew up to serve the new classes, the new literate classes, and as women in the 19th and more in the 20th century began to enter public life with rights, equal rights growing in society, in politics, and in the economy. In many ways, that search for the truth, to tell the truth about society and power, above all power, holding power to account, which is the common phrase used by journalists of themselves, strengthened after the war, and has remained the underlying moral purpose of journalism. That isn't to say that everybody does it. Actually, quite often, not very many people do it. A lot of journalism isn't about that. A lot of journalism is about entertainment and gossip and fashion and so on. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not. It hasn't got a particular moral purpose. A lot of it is to make money. But the moral purpose assumes, again, as Leonid Nikitinski said earlier, assumes that there is something called the truth, in spite of postmodernism, and that it can be found and told, at least in shortened form, in skeletal form, and that by telling it, people benefit as citizens. This is, I think, now recognized, though not followed all around the world. It's recognized that this is the base of the moral or the ethical base of journalism. Though, as I say, it's not always followed, and you can argue actually that it's a minority following, and I'll say something about that. It's also often not very popular with people themselves. There's something I wrote in the book about the well-known Belarusian writer, journalist, Svetlana Alexeyev, who won the Nobel Prize 3 years ago, I think. Alexievich, sorry. 3 or 4 years ago. And she published a book called Zinky Boys in English about the demoralization of young Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan. And it was published, and she was sued by some of the subjects of the book and by an organization of the soldiers' mothers who objected to her stories about what the soldiers had done in Afghanistan. And one of the mothers giving evidence to the trial said, "I loved the Soviet Union, the country we used to live in, and I hate you, Alexievich. I hate you. I hate your scary truth." In other words, this woman recognized that the writer was writing the truth, but she hated hearing it. And that's quite a common reaction, I think. People quite often don't like the truth, and quite a lot of people don't listen to the news or read the news because they find it depressing. It often is depressing. But the truth, we journalists think, is necessary for society. There must be a critical mind in society, and it must proceed from the truth. And when it is censored, and Tatiana Lisova talked about that earlier on, the critical mind is necessarily shrunken. Investigative journalism, which really began in the United States, is now globalized, in some cases at least. The Panama Papers, which were these papers which were taken from a law company which specialized in tax evasion in Panama, hundreds of thousands of documents which illuminated what leaders and business people and rich people all through the world, how they evaded tax, were taken out. And papers showed what happened in the Kremlin, what happened with the president of Ukraine. It hasn't stopped corruption, but at least people knew what was happening. It was worked on by reporters in Russia, as well as hundreds of reporters all over the world worked on the Panama Papers about their country and illuminated what public figures were doing with their money, often with public money. Business journalism, which, as I said, began in ports like Antwerp and London and Venice, has become hugely important. Vedomosti is a business newspaper, first of all, and the business papers for which Arkady and I both work, they're not just about business, especially the Economist, but they are about finance, economics, politics, foreign affairs, so on. And one of the reasons why they're good to work on is that they depend upon being accurate. They force you to find out the truth because it's important that people know the truth very often because it's important for them to make money. For those of you who have read or seen the Shakespeare play Merchant of Venice, which is about a merchant in Venice who has given lots of money to his best friend and takes out a loan with a moneylender called Shylock, and then can't pay the loan and is faced with death because of it. The Merchant of Venice was written and performed before newspapers, but it's almost anticipating the newspaper age. It begins with someone asking, what's the news on the Rialto? The Rialto was the place where merchants met in Venice. The Rialto Bridge is still there, very beautiful bridge. And people asked each other what's happening to Antonio's ships. He's got cargoes which he has financed in ships, and they're all over the world, and some of them have been wrecked. People need the news. They ask in the play questions all the time about what's the news, what's the facts. And that demand of people who were in trade, and trade was growing enormously, especially in important places like London and Antwerp and Venice and elsewhere. And newspapers came up to serve that. And of course, the media can be very profitable. It can be very profitable in Russia, it can be profitable in this country. It was Rupert Murdoch, the owner of Fox News, makes a lot of money out of Fox News. He loses money in Sky News, but he makes probably a great deal more in Fox News, which is Donald Trump's favorite channel, and a very favorite channel of very many people. In the chapter in the book on India, where journalism, nearly all kinds of journalism, are growing very strongly. One of the big companies in India, which publishes a newspaper called The Times of India and has TV channels and so on, we gave an interview to an American reporter a couple of years ago, and one of the bosses of this company said, in the newspaper business, we're not in the newspaper business. We're in the advertising business. If 90% of your money comes from advertising, you're in the advertising business. And what these two brothers who own this do is that they put in advertisements, sometimes whole-page advertisements for films or for commodities of various kinds, and they make him look like a page in the newspaper. It's what you might call faked news. And in tiny, tiny print, 8-point print, very, very small, difficult to read, they put at the bottom, this is an advertisement. But usually people have read it before that, and they make people pay for it. And that's quite common now in the world. So media is also a business itself. Sometimes a very big business, sometimes a very profitable business, and even when it's not profitable, it's often done to increase the power and the influence of those who own it, sometimes people who are interested in politics, so on. It's worth thinking now that, reflecting now that in the countries of the world, probably most people live in countries where the media is to a greater or lesser extent controlled by the state or by the party or both, the state party. And that includes China, Egypt, Turkey, Philippines, and of course Russia. And although it is not controlled by the state or indeed a party, in America there is now a president who constantly attacks the media. We can come back to that later. In Russia, President Putin came to power when he said that when he came to power, he said he would protect a free press. There's legislation which ensures that the press, or should ensure that the press is free. But when a tragedy happened, it showed another side of him. And that tragedy was the one that you will remember some years ago now, when the submarine Kursk, the most modern submarine in Russia, sank, and everyone on it died. It was a nuclear submarine, the most advanced in Russia, and there was a meeting. Putin had not been in office very long. He was on holiday. He didn't come at first to the site to meet the relatives of the sailors who had died, but he finally did come, and he had a meeting with these relatives in a hall, and one of the people asked, why did you not accept Western aid, which was offered, Western aid to bring the submarine up, technology which Russia didn't have to bring the submarine up, which might have succeeded in saving the men in it. And the woman who asked said that she'd seen this on television. And Putin replied, you saw it on television. That means they're lying. They're lying. They're lying. These are people on television who have been working to destroy the army and the navy for 10 years. All they really want to do is finish it off. They've stolen all the money, and now they're buying everyone off and making whatever laws they want to make. Some of that may be true. It's not as though the people who owned television in Russia or anywhere else are angels. But it did show that what the president thought of media was that they were a hostile force, and he quickly made sure that certainly the television, or most of television, would cease to be that hostile force. And that's been true even more severely in other countries, but above all in China. In Russia, you know much better than I, there's space for different opinions, for news which is uncomfortable for the government, so on. But that's not true in China, by and large. It had been true for some time when there was a loosening of the control over media, but it's not true now after President Xi Jinping came to power and laid down the law that the party, the Communist Party, which of course runs the country, is more important than the news. He made a speech a year or two after he came to power, and he said that change was as rapid and large in propaganda and ideology as in every other sphere of his country's progress. But its fundamental task, the task of the media, had not changed, and he said, cannot change. Its central effort must be to continue to consolidate, quotes, the guiding spirit of Marxism and a common ideological basis for the united struggle of the entire party and the entire people. And he said that Western countries talk about press freedom, but in fact they also have ideological baselines. They are under the control of interest groups and the inclinations of political parties. And that's also partly true. What it leaves out, however, is that there's competition between them, and there is a general view, as I said earlier, that the truth has to be told, and very often it is. In most Arab countries, journalism has always been and remains controlled or owned by the state and the party. It changed a bit with the advent of Al Jazeera. Qatar, the state of Qatar owns it. Often it answers to Qatar's, especially Al Jazeera Arabic, not so much Al Jazeera English, but it answers to the foreign policy of Qatar. It supported the Muslim Brotherhood. It supported President Morsi in Egypt, who was a Muslim Brotherhood member. And when he was taken out of power with a coup against him by the army, Al Jazeera criticized and was ultimately thrown out of Egypt. And the journalists of Al Jazeera, 3 of them were put in jail. They're all now released, but they were in jail for quite some time. When El-Sisi, the president, who was the chief of the defense staff, he was a field marshal, came to power, the main editors of the newspapers and the television channels met and volunteered to become organs of the state. They said that Egypt was under attack by terrorists, which partly was true, and that they would never go against the government. In other words, they volunteered to be controlled by the state and have remained so. I said earlier that the most dangerous, in the West at least, example of a leader of a country which had been the example of freedom in the press, America, is Donald Trump. And I wrote off that Trump is now deliberately destroying an ideal which, however much it inflated itself and was inflated by others, proposed a practice of robust inquiry based on truth, which was a large part of the international view that America stood for liberalism and for free journalism. Trump attacked the media for the same reason as he attacked others, to destroy trust. And in doing so, trying to destroy trust in the institution most requiring it as a basis for its existence. And in doing so, he has implicitly and explicitly demanded that trust be placed only, or at least mainly, in him. The truth begins and ends in him. And for that to come from an American president is a quite extraordinary event. Trump is an extraordinary event in many different ways, but that he should attack an institution of which the United States has done more than any other society to develop and to insist that it be free from the state, that it should try to tell the truth, that it should check, that it should be a resource for citizens, especially in newspapers, but also on television, that the President of the United States should act in this fashion is one of the largest events, certainly in the journalistic world of the last century. Telling the truth has always been a struggle. It's a struggle everywhere, in authoritarian states for reasons you well know. In democratic countries, it's a struggle too, sometimes nothing like in authoritarian states, but it's a struggle to get information. But it's also a struggle to make it important. As I said earlier, when talking about Alexievich and the news and people not liking the news, the reaction, "I hate your scary truth," is widespread. People don't want to see and read what they don't like. But also it's because the truth is endless. You can say something is true, but in a skeletal form. This happened. The president said this. The applause was long, etc. All that is true, but it's not very much. You have to dig deeper, try to understand what the speech was about, what the opposition, if there is one, thinks of it, what the policies are, how far they've been successful. Will they continue? Will they cease? And these things are complicated because government is complicated, policies are complicated, and the way in which any country or in which the world is run is complicated. And following the truth is hard. Harder, of course, hard for journalists to do, to find out, but also hard for an audience to follow, and many people don't. We in journalism often miss the deeper truth because we don't have the time, and very often too because we or our editors understand that people won't read it or watch it, that it's not very popular. And so we're left with parts of the truth, but quite a lot of questions unanswered. That's the way that society is, the way that our profession, our trade has to act. We have to continue in our trade on the assumption that people will read it, understand it, and possibly act upon it. But very often that assumption isn't followed through. In papers like Arkady's and mine, for a quite small sliver of the elite in society around the world, the kind of people who are presently at Davos now in the snow, these people act upon it because it's their business. It's what has made many of them rich. It's what made many of them powerful. They need it. But for the idea that citizens, ordinary people, will read the news and become better citizens, sometimes it works. Very often it doesn't. It's the enigma or perhaps the drama, even the tragedy of our trade, that underlying it is that what we're in business for doesn't really work. At the Reuters Institute, which is in this city of Oxford, which I and others founded some years ago, a centre of research and publication on journalism, we did a focus group some years ago 9 years ago, when in the Democratic primaries in the United States, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were competing for the nomination of the Democratic Party so that they could be the candidate for the presidency against whoever was chosen from the Republican side. And we did focus groups, about 9 focus groups in the city of Leeds and Yorkshire in Britain. 9 focus groups of about 10 or 12 people, asked lots of questions about, and one of the questions was about the event, the competition between Obama and Clinton for the nomination for the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. Nobody in these focus groups knew that this was a competition for the nomination for the presidency. Everybody thought it was a competition for the presidency, that Obama and Clinton were fighting each other in order to be president, not in order to fight a Republican for president. And some of these people were teachers and people who read a good deal, but nobody, but on the news most nights, there was a big struggle between the first woman to be president, the first black American to be president, but nobody understood or had taken the time to understand. A recent poll showed that some 20% of people in this country think that we have already left the European Union. There was a vote last year, and 20 or 25% people think that we are now out of the European Union. And yet every day on the news, sometimes extremely boring, there's news about the negotiations on Brexit, how well they're doing, usually how badly they're doing. And yet people believe that we're no longer members of the European Union. It shows that the news which is supposed to empower people very often passes them by. Propaganda, which we've talked about before this afternoon, realizes this. People who put out propaganda realize that people prefer what Nicotinsky called myths rather than the truth, the complex facts, the uncomfortable facts, the scary facts. So propaganda, conspiracy theories, alternative facts, constructed in order to get inside people's heads, things that people will see because they're vivid images and they shock people. Propaganda always has the edge over truth in that sense, especially on television, because television conveys images much better. But if we remain in journalism, which I'm sure many of you will, then that's what we have to contend with. That's what we have to take on. That's what we have to fight. But that is more your task now than mine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure again to be back to this audience, back to the school, and especially such a pleasure to be sitting next to John, who is not just a friend, but a very close person to me, and who is the person whom I owe, or whom I can blame actually for finding myself in this job. And in point of fact, because it's not because John helped me and has been helping me with his ideas, with his advice, but because, if to speak on the serious note, John was exactly what for me and has been and will be for me and remains a man whom, once I've met him and as I've been looking at how he works, this is something that has been giving me an idea and still gives me an idea why it is important to go for it and why is it so exciting to do it. And in this sense, this remains and has been and remains a main driver for me. So meeting John and a happy opportunity to work with him when he was in Moscow, a correspondent of the Financial Times, this is something that made me perceive in a very different way journalism, this trade of journalism. And because I met him, it made me understand that this is worth going for, that it's interesting. It's not just losing your time. It's just awfully interesting and such a much-needed thing. What is it that amazed me most at that time? And that was, I'm sorry, I will be speaking about him. I'll speak about him, and then about another journalist. Well, that's enough. No, it's not enough, because it immediately has to do with our conversation, with what John has been telling you and what I'll try to, again, discuss with you and what we've been doing. That was 1991, what, 92 probably? Yes, was it? 1992, 1991? That was back then when I met John. I at the time was was just about to be graduating at the theatre studies class in the. I was going into to study and research the history of theatre and go. I thought I would go into art, into become a critic, but then I met John, and it impressed me strongly, so strongly that, well, it's been almost 30 years since then, and I'm still in journalism. What is it that amazed me? 1991, 1992, that was the time not just of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, not just political, not just a point in time when all the institutions, social links collapse, economy collapses. In point of fact, the country is in a condition, in a state of vacuum, not knowing what comes next, because after romantic and heroic days of August 1991, which filled everyone with a feeling of pride, quite justified pride, for what? For the fact that Russia and Russians, in a bloodless way, won and gained an upper hand over the regime that had existed since 1917 and only brought death and non-freedom. After heroic days of standing next to the White House, the next question is, what do we do next? Where are we? What kind of country are we in? And newspapers would pop up. That was the most exciting time, I suppose, in the recent history of Russian journalism, because newspapers and then soon the television that followed it, named NTV, that at that time was conceived and in a year and a half, in the very late of 1993. Journalism at the time was exactly the place, because it all happened incredibly fast, very, very rapidly. Things followed. Journal, probably it happened too fast for authors, for researchers, for people who are in humanities to understand what is going on, because indeed the picture was changing, well, incredibly fast. Journalism was exactly the place where they would come up with a future vision of what life would be like next in the future. The newspapers, the most important newspaper of the country, that was, I'm not referring, of course, to its coverage about its circulation. I'm speaking about its intellectual weight. The main newspaper at the time was The Kommersant, which the chief editor and the publisher was Vladimir Yakovlev, son of the legendary Soviet journalist, 1960s, Yegor Yakovlev, chief editor of the Moscow News, one of the closest people who were closest to Gorbachev. Once they they protested against the generation of their fathers and their ideas of the 60s, Vladimir Yakovlev was producing a newspaper together with his friends that started as the first cooperative. But that newspaper, as I was saying, its whole thrust, it actually despised many things like very high-flown, stylish things. But there was this high-flown sort of aspiration that they had, like saying no to the ideas of their fathers, the Шестидесятники. They put the blame on them. They blamed them for not only for serving, we're part of the Soviet Union, we're part of the Soviet system. They tried to, well, reanimate, maybe resuscitate these ideas back in the 1960s, what is known as socialism with a human face. And what they were most unhappy about, the too much focused on ideology, although the Kommersant was too much into the ideology. The ideology was about refusing to support the views of their parents. And you probably know their motto. It still is there. You know what it looks like. There was just a subtitle where it says, it was said that this newspaper was founded in 1909 and was not published in the time. It was founded in 1909, was not circulating between 1917 until 1991 for the reasons that did not depend upon the editors. That was very much in line with something typical of this newspaper. That was some kind of mocking, fun subtitle that was typical of that editorial staff, because it meant a lot, because it was thought that all this time when the newspaper was not published between 1970 and 1991, we'll just cut it out with our scissors this time. We'll put it away, because for us it doesn't matter. We just, in some miraculous way, we shall reunite, going back to 1909 or mythological 1913. That was the last year before the First World War. And we will just take away all things Soviet, and we'll just take it aside, this Soviet project, and we'll reinstitute this continuity. And we'll program this life. It will be capitalist. It will be this newspaper. You need to read it in the morning when you take a cup of coffee with a glass of orange juice, fresh orange juice. That was the sort of... We had a gentleman, Alexander Timofeevsky, who was a critic, like internal critic in that newspaper. He was writing how this newspaper cultivates this new lifestyle, where that was like, for 200 years has been just growing, was just nurtured like British lawn. But that was not there. No banks were around, no capitalism was around, no continuity was around. It was all like make-believe. There was a country that was really raped by, and almost in some way emasculated life in the years of the Soviet epoch. At this time, Prime Minister Gaidar, he said that the winter of 1991 was the most horrible time in my life. Why am I saying that it's all connected to John and this trade? Because what I saw then, on the one hand, we had a newspaper which was meant to cater for me and for my generation, and which described, it's not to describe, but it was programming the reality in one way, but close, just near, next to it, there was very different kind of journalism. There's Financial Times and John Lloyd. Financial Times, exactly the Financial Times. It's not it, but the type and the kind of newspaper that evolved in the Rialto market in Venice, in the ports of Rome, where they needed information and they need exact description of reality. And what amazed me most, this maniac-like, I would put it this way, desire not to program reality, not to invent make-believe worlds around you, instead trying to describe the reality that you see before you with your own eyes. And that is amazing respect for what is known as reality or truth, or whatever name you choose for that. And again, respect for life, which is the same thing. And being sure that real life, reality is sacred, and you cannot interfere with it. That is why it was much more profound. It was not about just one needed to know what were the prices for the goods and commodities that were brought into Venice from, say, Constantinople, or from Constantinople to London or wherever. The thing is that they had an understanding that there is life, there is truth, and you have to respect it, and you have to treat it with respect as something that cannot be violated. You can't lie about it. there were two newspapers, like the Kommersant, that claimed to program reality, thinking and modeling oneself in some way after the Financial Times and the New York Times. Truthfully, most of the journalists who worked for the Kommersant never seen it. But next to it was exactly this pink newspaper. It was printed on pink, the Financial Times. And this was, in point of fact, there was a collision. Because as they thought that one may borrow this style, or may print the prices for the goods for the black market and then for the real stock exchange that was evolving at the time, as they were carrying publications of the same length. The Kommersant at the same time, and journalism as a whole in Russia in the early 1990s were absolutely confident that they were making what was like the Western journalism and Western press, never grasping the most important thing maybe, which was about those newspapers, that is, what I mentioned, respect for reality, to life and the need to describe it as is, and being absolutely confident that there is truth. And their position of principle was, yes, that truth exists, that all these talks, well, it's all about propaganda, it's all just your personal perspective, it's all relative. No, it isn't. No, it isn't relative, because goods may have this price, or no, it is not that price, because this ship that carries these goods to Venice, they have this sort of power, that much power in his engines. On the port building may have 6 columns and not 9 columns. You can't really lie about this, because your reputation stands on this. I suppose this was, and this is, and remains the main collision, both then and now and before the Soviet times, and in the Soviet times. In a certain way, whatever is happening in America is some kind of a mirrors, which is something what we can easily observe now in America, obsession about the facts, whatever Trump says, but Trump never lived in the Soviet Union. Trump may have many shortcomings, but surely he's not a product of the Soviet epoch. But his attitude towards the truth, his ability to lie, the way he lies, in many ways it is of the same nature as President Putin's. The one has the background of the Soviet KGB, and the other one was a self-made man, as I would say, pretty little successful businessman in America. Which brings me actually what I wanted to discuss with you. It's not so much about the propaganda, not only about the political regime, although certainly it matters. And whatever John was saying, like division into free, and of course media work in different ways in free societies and authoritarian societies. But for me, the question is that I think is important to me is that to say that, well, yes, Russia surely today is an authoritarian country, is a hybrid authoritarianism. Consensual, if you will, authoritarianism, with the permission, with a sort of endorsement of the country's citizens and elites, but you can't claim it is a totalitarian country. One cannot write or describe reality the way it is. No, yes, you can. Yes, you can. A different story. Is there a demand for that? And yes, should I be wrapping up? No? Oh, sorry. And at the long run, in the long run, you can even write objectively, describe the reality. Nobody would jail you for that. And in the long run, nobody is imposing to the public at large, to the population, where there are alternative, let's say the truth, there are alternative sources of information. There is internet, there is the Vedomosti, there is the Novaya Gazeta, there is RBK. Many people read in English. Here is the Economist, here's the Financial Times. People watch television not because somebody ordered them to watch it. No, they watch Channel 1 not because somebody ordered them. Said, if you don't watch Channel 1, and like Slavinsk, as they are crucifying Russian boys, 3-year-olds during the war. You may have forgotten that story, yes. The time of the war in Ukraine or with Ukraine, they showed a story on Channel 1 about the 3-year-old boy who was crucified by Ukrainian fascists. The thing is that there was never such a boy, and there were no fascists, as the speaker thinks. But there was a story on Channel 1. Nobody is standing with a gun to your head and saying, no, if you say it never happened, look, we will jail you. Well, certainly we can't say anything like this. Is in Russia. No. When I spoke to general manager of Channel 1, Konstantin Ernst, I said, how come? There was no boy. He said, no, so what? Well, yeah. Probably there was no boy. Or maybe he was. Maybe it happened. Maybe it didn't. Prove that it never happened. And then, this is what they teach you in the first year in legal school. You can't prove the negative things. You can't prove non-existent things. You can only prove that something happened because there were witnesses around. But when something didn't happen, how can you prove that it never happened? In principle, it's just impossible. What if maybe it happened, maybe it didn't? But then planes go down, Malaysian Boeings, and people vote supporting the war. But what am I saying it? Why? Why is it that it's not about some regime? It's not about totalitarianism alone. A different story why it happens. And here, for sure, political systems play a fundamental. It's a matter of principle. The thing is how they are working on mass conscience. Because I think the psychological factor and what those who call themselves journalists, what they appeal to, very often they just work for propaganda. They're not journalists. What they appeal to and how this brainwashing works, it is much more sophisticated and much more interesting than might seem to you at first sight. And it's not a purely Soviet or post-Soviet phenomenon. It's not a purely American phenomenon because, well, Russia was rising from its knees. President Trump said that we'll make America great again. And again, we'll rise, make it rise from its knees. But it mirrors. But because of that, I also brought a book. It's not my book.
A book which was published last year, and the one which I certainly suggest to read. Journalists writing about Russia should read it. It's very modestly published, but it's very important. It's called A.S. Suvorin, A Portrait Against the Background of a Newspaper. It was written by a great historian of the Russian culture, possibly the greatest, Natan Solovyov and Vera Shidova. This book was written in the beginning of the 1960s, for the Novy Mir literary journal, headed by Twardowski at the time, and at the time when Novy Mir and Ogonyok journals were competing very strongly. Ogonyok was sort of a pro-Stalinist in the 1960s, and it was still 1949 imbibed journal. The book was never published. It was published in the questions of literature towards the end of the 1970s, and the manuscript was only discovered 6 months ago, and it was published. Who knows about Suvorin? Not many people. Suvorin, Alexander Suvorin, was indeed the first Russian, if not the first global media tycoons. His newspaper started to be published from 1872 and was published until 1917. He died in 1912. Suvorin died in 1912. He is the first media tycoon in the Russian Empire. He was known, very famous for correspondent of Anton Chekhov. He created his newspaper. He was a very well-known man in St. Petersburg, and he started Novoye Vremya, the New Time newspaper, which was a privately held newspaper for the middle class, for the urban dwellers who increasingly lived in the Russian cities in the 1870s and onwards, after the serfdom was abolished and the reform of Alexander II. There was a period of great urban development in Russia. It was a newspaper for the city dwellers. So it was remarkable how quickly the social structure of Russia started to change at around this time. And at that time, that person, Suvorin, came to the arena, who understood the necessity of organizing this middle class, of this fragmented consciousness which entered the cities. When Bazarov and the nihilism, the so-called Russian nihilism, was already on the rise. This is a book about Mr. Suvorin and his newspaper, which has a direct link to what had been happening to the events of 1860s and 1870s, and to what is happening today on the screens of the Russian TV and on the newspaper pages. A review for this book was written by a major Russian philosopher, Sergei Averentsov, a great Russian scientist and Byzantologist, who wrote about this book in one monumental phrase as to what is happening today. The theme is very interesting and very relevant. How is the consciousness of a fragmented society manipulated? How it is possible to raise the secondary nationalistic intolerance, which is not related to any patriarchate, but compensating for a representative of this politicized mass of any organic feeling. So we're talking about nationalism as a secondary identity. Secondary identity which is not growing out from some traditionalism or deep entrenched traditionalism, but as a compensating concept at the time of fragmentation, on the cusp of atomization due to great social change. This, I think, is directly related to what is happening in Russia today. How was Alexander Suvorin working? How did he work? What did he do to build this newspaper as an organizing mechanism? John spoke about journalism as a description of reality, answering a demand. In the Russian journalism, starting from Suvorin, journalism is often seen as an starting point, modeling a country, bearing a huge responsibility. In the 1870s, the Balkan question, the Ottoman Turkey, the question if Russia must intervene in the Balkan crisis and to start champion Bulgaria against the Turks. The Turkish atrocities against the Slavic peoples are constantly described. At the same time, Bulgaria is portrayed in all its beauty as a land. The nobleness and the great enthusiasm of the Russian nation are called up. And I can quote several times. Suvorin was not afraid that the freshness of perception would be gone. No, he wanted the staple to be entrenched in the public consciousness. He was hoping that an associative chord to be taken, and something that would immediately click in the minds of his readers. He would, there is a quotation, rich, God-blessed country is imploring Russia to get rid of the terrible yoke of the Turk. And it's a great, rich, wonderful country. And this was, as I said, written in 1860s, 1870s. But the authors of this little brochure, which was written in the 1960s, but the rhetoric with respect to the Ukraine and Crimea about the delivery of Slavic brothers against the fascist nationalists. And it's a great country, and we had great sanatoria there, and there are the vineyards, and it's amazing how such cliches continue to work. It's amazing how the same psychological mechanisms are clicked in. With what Suvorin did and what the Russian media did in the past years, in the recent years, there is a lot of feeling of ignorance and the feeling of how the values and ideas are really despised. The questions which were occupying the mind of Count Lev Tolstoy were certainly out from the mind of the media and the newspapers of Suvorin. The perception that the good in the Russian language is at the same time moral quality and prosperity. So this consumption-driven enthusiasm as if there are no great moral issues, as if the three sisters have never been written. What beautiful trees, what beautiful life there should be around them. As if the life is polarized according to a principle that either there is the good, the house, the apartment, be it an apartment in a five-story Khrushchev house or in the Razyerzh room in St. Petersburg of the 1870s. It really doesn't matter. Life is divided according to this principle. It's either making the good and becoming prosperous or becoming a member of a revolutionary underground, as if there is no other normal life. This is how Suvorin worked with his readership. And that's how he pressed with these emotional electrodes. Nationalism was perpetrated without hysteria, without much nerve, as they say, but in a very placid way, with appealing to the common sense. The nationalism as becoming prosperous yet again. Nationalism was served in Suvorin's newspaper as the goods advertised in the Новое Время newspaper. Here, there is an advertisement and immediately an article about the Turkish atrocities. There was this appeal to the feeling of humiliation and the nobility and the nobleness to the need to protect your friends and brothers. In some time, there was immediately an article about a priest and an article about the Jewish question. And then another article in a matter on the same page about harsh treatment of animals. No, Новое Время did not at that time go down to anti-Semitism, but this time was to come shortly. So in the beginning, Suvorin's newspaper was writing about Turkey, how the Russian women are taken to the Turkish Empire and enslaved. Suvorin wanted to see nationalism, and he liked Zionism. But he was saying, do you think they will leave, that is, they, the Jews, to work there? No, they'll stay. Of course, it would be better to take all the Jews to the Gobi and Shamo, to ban them from coming to the Christian states, but nobody would try and come to such a conclusion. In some time, an observer of the same newspaper, Menshikov, started to yell about the Russian people subjugated by the foreigners. One of those who has read this newspaper and who admired such writings was a man by the name of Alfred Rosenberg from the Baltic regions of Russia, who went to Germany and became one of the ideologists of the Nazi order. This could have, and one of those who wrote just when Novое Время was starting to develop, when it was still a very successful, energetic private newspaper. There was a letter to Mr. Suvorin from a man from America. Wyndham Randolph Hearst, the future publisher of New York Times, wrote Suvorin in Russia. So it's about the manipulation of public consciousness and what are the psychological mechanisms of making them work. Mr. Suvorin was deriving. He was not a. He was an educated man, and he at least declared he wanted the good. He was an admirer of Lev Tolstoy, but he thought that such deliberations are totally irrelevant, and that he thought not without substance. He wanted to quench and indeed quell the revolutionary sentiment in the 1880s and the 1890s. He thought that the revolutionary sentiment must be suppressed, that it is important to conserve. This is a rational society, otherwise it would have been overtaken by an evil end. So he believed that there have to be all measures taken to distance from ideas. So nationalism as a palliative care was the main ruling trend of this newspaper. Suvorin was emanating from, or was departing from his view of the public good. When the nationalism, as distinct from the European nationalism, which was developing as a liberal idea, an anti-imperial idea. Nationalism and liberalism at the end of the 19th century in Europe is virtually the same. In Russia, nationalism was served as an imperial, anti-liberal idea. And what happens during a chemical reaction between the lack of ideas on the one hand and an idea of a life outside of history, and the collision of these ideas? What kind of explosion do we see then? Suvorin did not live to see. He died in 1912. He died 5 years before this chemical reaction happened in Russia. I think that any attempts to inhibit, to conserve, to inject, to make an injection of nationalism, to preclude the history from moving forward, are doomed, or are bound to end in a disaster. Indeed, the words of Alexei Navalny are in a way close to the ideas of the beginning of the 20th century, whereby Russia must be a nation state, not an imperial state. And an attempt to juxtapose this with the imperial nationalism based on resentment, based on the feeling of humiliation, the need for compensation, the enemies, and so on. I think that this collision is unfolding before our eyes. And the great the dynamic development of the Russian economy in the beginning of the 21st century, the growth of the Russian cities, growth of the middle class, growth of per capita income in Russia over the past 15 years against the background of ideological clashes. Some things repeat themselves because the government, be it the government of a country or the editorial board of a newspaper, repeat certain patterns which are often taking us to the same points of conflict. And it seems to me that the process which is unfolding in Russia today is a process of radicalization, a process of repulsion against the so-called traditional values. I have been present in several meetings of Mr. Navalny with his supporters in different places, including Vladivostok, and one of the most common questions was surprising. I thought that people would be asking questions about Putin and corruption, but suddenly people were asking Mr. Navalny a question about the Russian Orthodox Church. And why is it that the bloggers are put in jail because they criticize the church, and this causes great irritation, because it's the same kind of hypocrisy. I remember the Komsomol workers with exactly the same faces that the popes of today are dictating as to what people should read or watch. It's like jumping into the icy water for baptism. I remember the Komsomol leaders. And in this sense, the media are very and greatly responsible. I think that an important process which we're seeing today because it turned out that the television is not at all popular, that the viewership of television is not nearly as popular as the YouTube. And even though Mr. Navalny has never been on the federal TV channel, 60% of the country know about him. So I think that the journalism may be different. There may be columnists, essayists, but I think that whatever you do in journalism, whatever newspaper you work, Financial Times, Kommersant, Yaroslavl regional newspaper, or in Vladivostok, there is only one principle which must be fundamental. Otherwise, it is not journalism. And one should not be calling himself or herself a journalist. This only rule is the respect for the reality of life and the penchant to describe it. It's not just about facts. It's not just about the price of oil or the price of grain or the price of furs exported to Venice, but the accuracy with which you resolve to explain or try to describe this reality. So this almost manic penchant for the truth, is a lot more important than any ideology. And this is what I have seen when I first met John, Lloyd, and Financial Times. Thank you.